Hello, welcome to the world of Word.
Coming up, another word in your attic.
And if you enjoy this, visit our Patreon to find out more about our exclusives and our general work of national importance.
The link is in the notes below. And now, on with the show.
Word in your attic, a Zoom with a view.
Welcome to a special edition of Word in Your Attic, because Dave and I have become enthralled by a book called Shellac And Swing, A Social History of the Gramophone in Britain. And we're joined by its author, Bruce Lindsay. Bruce, lovely to see you. Welcome aboard.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for asking me.
Not at all. And how has lockdown been? And where are you, in fact?
I'm in Broadland in Norfolk. I'm in a village about 8 miles north of Norwich.
Yeah.
Very edge of Broadland.
How has lockdown been?
It's been okay for me because I'm not a particularly sociable chap anyway. So just me and my wife Julie, and occasional visits from our lads. It's been fine.
Right. Very nice.
We've stayed healthy, so that's the main thing.
That's the main thing, exactly. So you've written a book about the history of shellac and the gramophone. So what's the fascination there? What made you want to get in there and do an entire book?
It's the impact. I've always been interested in the impact objects and things have on the way people live their lives, and because I've been a musician and a music writer for years, and I've loved music since I was little. The gramophone seems to be a crucial element in that. And when I went to look for information about the gramophone, this kind of object here, as opposed to the record player or heaven forbid the CD player, there wasn't anything. So I thought, right, let's have a look. I trained as a historian a few years ago. My period is kind of late 19th, early 20th. So I started digging around, and it's just this fascinating story. It's not about the technology so much. It's about the impact it had on people's living rooms, on people's entertainments, on politics, on pornography, on all sorts of stuff.
So if we can do a brief history of sound recording, it started in the 1850s, wasn't it, with recordings being made onto smoked paper? Isn't that right?
Yeah, there was a guy in France called Louis Scott de Matonville, and he decided to record sound on smoky paper. So you get a piece of paper and you smoke it, make it sooty, and then you can make a little groove in the soot. And so he made a few very primitive recordings in 1860, I think is the first one we really know. But he didn't intend people to listen to them. He intended people to look at them, which I think is wonderful. You go to all this trouble to record a human voice or a guitar or a lute or whatever, and then you get the piece of paper that the grooves on, and you say, look at this, everybody.
So it's just the patterns, that's all it is.
Yes, look at these wavy lines.
It's one of the things that's kind of theme all the way through the book, isn't it? That the way technology is designed is not necessarily how people use it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he designed it to be looked at when, a few years later, Edison developed the cylinder phonograph. He mostly thought the profit was in business dictation machines as well. And even Berliner was sort of looking at things like recording different periods in your life, so that when you finally popped your clogs 70 years hence, your relatives could play these little snatches of your voice from different points in your life.
Yeah, Berliner was the inventor of the gramophone, right?
Berliner was the person who, instead of recording on wax discs, which go round and round and round and round like that, you recorded on records which go round and round and round like that,
and recorded by just singing into a kind of a metal funnel, right, going direct to the needle.
Yeah, I mean, if you sort of look at this again, I mean, this isn't the recording machine, but this part of it was common to the recording machine. So you get a huge big horn, metal or papier-mâché or something, and the performer would basically have to force air down the horn to the tracking needle, which would cut the groove in the disc. And from that disc, that had a master disc, you would then make copies. But it was acoustic recording. So key importance for a singer or a comedian was a loud and powerful voice.
Yeah.
Not a subtle sort of romantic voice. And the same with instruments. Some instruments recorded much better than others. Piano was notoriously difficult. So you raised the piano up on a platform, so it was directly level with the horn. Trumpets, trombones were terribly loud, so they tended to overwhelm everything else. Double basses were very difficult, so you tended to use brass for bass instrumentation as well. And you would put people in different parts of the studio rather than keeping them all together to get the balance right. And these were one-take recordings. If you messed up in the middle, you either carried on and kept the mistake in, or you started again.
Yeah. Which is really interesting, because the invention of tape, we're jumping forward here, but the invention of tape meant that you had a completely different type of singer. It didn't have to be a singer who was loud, demonstrative, could do it in one go. You could edit it, and you could and also the invention of the microphone, bringing in people like Al Bowley and Bing Crosby, who just had a softer approach, didn't they? More intimate.
Yeah, the microphone, the electric microphone, which was about 1925, 1926, developed in the States. That was a game changer for performers who had much more subtle and nuanced approaches, and for things like an acoustic guitar that could be recorded. The range, the recordable range widened hugely. Yeah.
So what are the great milestones in the kind of popularization of the gramophone and the gramophone record?
In terms of popularization, the first thing is Berliner himself, because Edison got a bit bored with the cylinder. He did produce cylinders, but he got a bit bored with developing the technology. Berliner came along a few years after Edison and developed the gramophone. And initially, the gramophone was clockwork, but it was hand wound, the very first gramophone. So you actually sit there, put the record on the gramophone, and grind away.
Oh, really? It only went round when you turned the handle.
Only went round when you turned the handle. So it wasn't really a commercial success. And then Berliner found a New Jersey engineer who developed a reliable clockwork motor. So when you wound the motor up, it would actually rotate the disc
at the same speed.
Yeah, and we call them 78s, but actually initially nobody really bothered. So you can get discs that rotated at 76, you could get discs that rotated at 84, as well as 79, 78. So you get the speeds written on the disc, so people know how to set their.
Oh, I see.
And the portable gramophone was invented far earlier than I thought, because we now think of, it's the cassette, or it's the battery operated record player. Those are the things that allowed you to go and listen to music where you wanted to hear it at the time you wanted to. But there's a bit where you mentioned somebody in 1914 swimming the channel and having a portable.
This was the wonderful Lily Smith. She was a long distance swimmer. I don't think she actually attempted the channel from England to France, but she certainly she did long swims in the channel, sort of 10, 15 mile swims in the channel. There's a report that when she was swimming, she would be sustained by beef tea handed to her from the support boat, but also the support boat had a gramophone on it, which they wound up and she heard music. And her favourite song, apparently, when she was swimming the channel, was a song called Asleep in the Deep, which is actually about people who've drowned. So I suspect she carried on. It was fear that drove her on to these feats. That was quite a chunky thing. I mean, it was portable in terms of a couple of strong mates could lug it out of the back of the car. But just before the First World War, you got the Decca Company, and the Decca Company produced probably the first successful, commercially viable, properly portable machine, as in a machine that was enclosed in a box, and all you had to do was carry it with a strap. When you got wherever you wanted to be, you put it down, you lifted the lid, and it was ready to go. And
of course you didn't need electricity, did you? So it was it made a lot of sense, didn't it? You probably didn't take many records with you, but it was what you did.
They weighed quite a lot, like this, but it did. I mean, tragically, it meant that when the war started, the guys at the front, both sides, Allies and Germans, had something to entertain them. Not necessarily.
So that was quite widespread, was it? People taking gramophones to the front line, pretty much.
Yeah, in fact, the guy who founded Decca joined up as well, and he was a driver, I think, initially, and then he got commissioned. But the Decca portable became so popular amongst the British Armed Forces that it became known as the trench Decca.
Oh, really?
Because you would get them, if not actually in the trench.
Do we know what they were playing?
They were playing all sorts of tunes, mostly kind of popular light entertainment, music hall, sketch comedy. That was quite popular at the time.
Yeah, I want to talk about this because comedy was a huge thing from early on, wasn't it? It was as big as music, wasn't it?
It was in the early stages. Comedy records. I mean, a lot of entertainers did both. So you get people like Harry Lauder, who was sold huge quantities of records. Was a comedian and a musician. But you had comic sketches. There's a guy called Russell Hunting, who was an American who'd been arrested and tried with producing pornographic wax cylinders.
That was there early on, was it?
Oh, yeah.
Always the case, is it? Whatever the new technology is pornography that leaps in first.
That's it. And he produced, under the, I don't know what would be the nom de performance of Willie Fathand, among others. And he got arrested and done. He came to Britain, set up his own company, and he also developed a character called Casey, who was this stereotypical daft Irishman, and produced loads of these records in the character of Casey, which was then picked up by other comedians, and they made their own versions. And every single one of them I've heard is notable for its complete lack of humour. So dreadful.
It is now.
It doesn't travel, does it? It doesn't travel. Very early humour does not travel.
Not at all.
It's partly the way it's recorded, I suppose, because they had to be just very, as you say, they had to be very loud. They had kind of project very hard, didn't they?
Yeah.
Don't get subtleties in that stuff at all.
No, I mean, occasionally you'd get duo comedy, but usually it was just one. It was a monologue.
Yeah.
They're just not funny. Whether they, the music hall versions were funnier, I don't know, but they certainly.
They certainly no. One thing that interests me is that there was. It always fascinates me with recorded sound that they're always looking for new ways to exploit the technology. And one of the things they were trying to do was to offer a kind of renditions of actual dramatic events that happened in real life. Yeah. But they would fake them, wouldn't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they would have to fake them. And for example, you could, before the First World War, you could buy a recording of a football game. Match 1, side A, match 2, side B. And these things only last 3 minutes. So you think, well, what 3 minutes? Do you randomly play, injury time in the first half? Or do you put together an invented set of highlights, kind of match the day on record?
That's it. Every aspect of that is insane because presumably you know the result of the game when you listen to the. It's just a memento, isn't it? It's a souvenir.
Yeah, and there were a lot of patriotic discs in the beginning of the First World War. In fact, around about the Boer War, they made a recording called "Departure of a Troop Ship." Which I've also been told Russell Hunting was involved in. And this is supposedly a recording of the departure of a ship filled with British forces on their way to South Africa. And you hear, sweethearts and wives shouting from the quayside and officers shouting patriotic phrases to the assemblage and a band playing.
Amazing.
And it's clearly not Southampton docks. And the most bizarre of all, I think, you could buy at the end of the First World War, you could buy, to show your patriotism, a recording of the British Royal Artillery bombarding German lines with gas shells.
Oh, right. That was real, was it?
That was purported to be real, but I've heard that one as well. And it's two blokes in the studio with a pop gun. It's so dull. But again,
the other thing...
It was a real event, but again,
Yeah. The other thing that we often forget, though, when we talk about these times, is this is a time before radio, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're still...
So it's the only form of recorded sound available to you is on a record, if you haven't had one.
Yeah, BBC Radio the British Broadcasting Company, as it was initially.
Yeah.
I think it was November 1922 it first broadcast to a very limited potential audience. So up until that point, the
so it's interesting, isn't it? So things like Dixieland Jazz, all that was completely made by record players, wasn't it? And by dance halls, presumably dance bands.
I mean,
radio.
I've in my collection, I've got the story of the original Dixieland Jazz.
Right, I guess.
Oh yeah.
Tell us that story, because they were not African Americans.
They were not. No, I think the main background was Italian. Nicola Rocca, the cornet player, was extraction. And these guys claim to have invented jazz, and the debate rages on for years and years and years. They've got a stronger claim, I think, to having the first jazz record made commercially available in 1917. And when they came over to Britain in 1919, they were the first genuine jazz band to play public concerts in England. But before that,
they played Buckingham Palace, didn't they? On that,
apparently they played all sorts of very strange things because they were the thing. You know,
absolutely,
they were the new sound. And what you had before that, of course, in Britain, the word jazz had appeared. Probably the first jazz performed in Europe was actually by African-American bands. There was an army lieutenant called Lieutenant James Europe, who ran an army band, an American army band in the First World War in Europe, coincidentally. And that was almost certainly the first, but they never recorded. But the word jazz was known. So the British record companies decided to stick the word jazz onto a record and declare it to be suitable for jazzing, which I think was the latest dance craze. So the first records with jazz in the title in Britain were from bands like the Coltrane Guards Band.
Not jazz bands at all.
Not jazz bands at all, not jazz records at all. So when the original Dixieland Jazz Band came over and brought the records over, that completely changed perceptions of jazz. And of course, you needed the records because the solos particularly don't lend themselves to notation. So
absolutely.
The jazz solo is pretty meaningless if you don't have any idea how it's supposed to sound.
Yeah, tell us about. I don't know if you've gone into this, but it always interests me that they always say during the 30s that quite a lot of American jazz only got recorded because of interest from British record companies, from people like Decca and people like that, because there was a market in the UK. Is that true?
There was a market. I think. I mean, it's one of these things about definition. It's this definition of jazz or swing.
Yeah.
Swing was the thing. You got Paul Whiteman, and swing bands of that sort. And I think a lot of American jazz musicians, the bottom fell a bit out of the market. The original Dixieland Jazz Band struggled. And then you got people who came over to Europe. I mean, Sidney Bechet is not the clarinet player, is normally the example cited as one of the earliest Americans to come over because their music was treated with respect, particularly in France. And so I think a lot of recordings were made for the British market, although the big sellers remained the British versions. So Jack Hilton and his jazz band, which are not quite as swinging as the Americans.
No.
What were the? Give us some examples of things that really popularised the gramophone. Because after kind of jazz, presumably there's the blues boom, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And then there was Mary Lloyd. Actually, Mary Lloyd might have been before that. I think there was a folk boom.
Mary Lloyd was before the First World War.
Yeah.
And you got people like the music hall stars helped popularise. Once the gramophone became cheap enough for a lot of working class households to buy it during the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. Then you get musical stars. Harry Lauder, I've mentioned. The first royalty-based contract for records was actually signed by a musical artist called, name's gone out of my head now, but it was a musical artist.
Don't worry.
The guy who recorded My Old Dutch.
Oh, okay.
Albert Chevalier.
Yeah.
We've been together now for 40 years and it don't seem a day too much. That one. Which
we all know that.
Thanks as well. Well, join in, David.
No, I do. I'm old enough to remember that. Yeah.
But you've also got, this is a Bessie Smith record of St. Louis Blues, which came out in the mid-20s. And that was a big record as well. Because it features
Louis Armstrong,
Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong on the same disc. So that kind of thing was popular as well. But the big sellers were, say, the Harry Lauders, Chevaliers, Harry Champion, the music hall artist who made a lot of records based around food and double entendres, and they all helped to popularise the gramophone. If you really wanted to splash out, all the gramophone companies had opera singers. Caruso recorded in 1902 for the Gramophone Company and got a really good royalty deal. Dame Nellie Melba recorded shortly afterwards for the Gramophone Company, and they were the big figurehead people. If you wanted to buy a Dame Nellie Melba record, it cost a guinea Now that's
It's a lot of money.
Huge amount of money.
£1.05p at a time when the average Norfolk farm labourer was earning less than £1 a week.
Yeah, yeah.
So they could get huge royalties on their sales, but their sales were relatively low.
They're quite small. So if you take, they always say in the late 20s in the States, they always, if you look at the dates of the great kind of blues recordings of, I don't know, whatever, they're always 1928, 29, and then it stops because there's a slump. And so people could afford record players during the late 20s, and then they couldn't anymore. Was that the same in the UK?
The business slumped, business slumped because of the Depression. But if you had a gramophone, you might still be able, the gramophone's a reliable beast, so you wouldn't buy a new gramophone. You might be able to afford an occasional record.
Right.
What really scared the gramophone companies, as you mentioned, was radio. And they thought, people hear.
Well, they would have seen that as a massive threat, wouldn't they?
Yeah, but it turned out.
But in fact, that brings us to a brilliant bit in the book where you tell the story of the guy who's, I think, called the first DJ, a guy called Christopher Stone, who has his own program, doesn't he? A recital of gramophone records arranged by Mr. Christopher Stone. And he's the first person to actually play gramophone records on the radio.
Yes.
So, there's a picture of him. Oh, right, yeah. So tell us his story, and he gets involved in all sorts of tangles, doesn't he? It's amazing.
He does. He's quite a surprising guy. I mean, the first thing about Christopher Stone is he's one of those British Army officers that had a portable gramophone in the trenches.
All right.
And he writes, just after the war, he writes quite movingly about the importance of the gramophone and the discs and how they would go, sometimes... they go into dangerous, half-demolished buildings to get the gramophone and the discs out. That was so important to the forces. After the war, Compton Mackenzie, the guy who wrote Whiskey Galore and helped set up the precursor to the Scottish National Party, he started the first magazine for gramophone enthusiasts called The Gramophone. It's still
Gramophone. Yeah.
And I'm not sure. I think Christopher Stone married Mackenzie's sister, or Mackenzie but anyway, Stone and Mackenzie became brothers-in-law, and Stone joined the Gramophone as a writer and eventually as an editor. So he was right in the heart of the business, reviewing records, meeting the stars that were performing on the records. And then Compton Mackenzie decided to beef up the BBC a little. It was very staid. Everybody said the BBC was very dull, and you got pirates making hay with this, particularly on Sundays. The first people to be charged and found guilty of radio piracy were two brothers in Norwich, actually, the Barker brothers, and they got done in the early 30s. Wow. But Christopher Stone got onto the BBC, and as Mark was saying, he was the first person to be a personality introducing records that he could enthuse about, rather than just an announcer saying, "You've just heard Enrico Caruso singing All You Need Is Love" on.
Yeah, he sort of knitted it together with editorial, didn't he?
Yeah. So Stone, he got into producing his own show every week. He chose his own records rather than being told by the BBC what records to play. He did a week at the London Palladium as top of the bill with a comic called Vic Oliver, where he would
where he played records backwards or something to demonstrate how thrilling this technology was.
He'd come on, he'd play a Caruso record, he'd play records backwards, then he'd meander around a bit, and he wasn't particularly charismatic on stage by all accounts. The Times reviewer seriously slagged him off. But he did it. He did a week on stage. And then the BBC, he's also probably, as well as being the first man called a DJ, Roy Plumley refers to this when he did Desert Island Discs in the 50s. He was also the first man to be investigated for what we would now call payola.
That's right. He was being paid by record companies to play their discs.
Yeah, there's no proof, I think, but they were very strong. They thought, well, this man's turning up with these records he says he likes, but, he's bringing them in, he's getting them free. We perhaps ought to have a quick look at this. And there was talk, still in the archive, there are memos around saying perhaps we ought to take the programming of the programme away from Mr. Stone and make sure he's not...
That's what I love about the BBC. It's always a written record somewhere.
The archive.
They've kept it all,
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
So that was it. The first DJ, first of many, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. So what the outstanding big hits? I mean, what are the kind of, the Whitney Houstons of their time? The ones that sold in millions of copies.
Again, it's quite extraordinary because we always sort of look back, and the record companies would have you believe that their customers were buying the classics, opera, and symphonies. Elgar was a leading sort of supporter of the Gramophone Company as well, and he opened Abbey Road Studios in the 1920s. Yeah. But the big sellers were really the music hall stars. But one of the biggest sellers was Master Ernest Loch, who was a 15-year-old chorister in one of the London churches, I believe.
Oh, is this "Oh for the Wings of a Dove"?
"Oh for the Wings of a Dove."
It is. Yeah.
He recorded "Oh for the Wings of a Dove." 1927, Master Ernest Loch went in and recorded "Oh for the Wings of a Dove." Within, I think, about 3 or 4 months, he'd sold 350,000 copies. And the original discs had been worn out. They'd stamped so many copies. The original masters and what have you, matrices, had worn out. So we had to go back in the studio. And
do it again.
Do it again. They didn't tell people it was slightly different, but you can.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, that's brilliant. But also, you actually, I mean, just playing those discs wore them out too. I mean, Dave and I are old enough to actually just about remember 78. I can remember the late 1950s, and if you played it more than a certain number of times, actually the quality got worse. You'd have to buy another.
Oh yeah, yeah. They did get worse if you didn't look after them, because that was it. You were supposed to change the needle every time you played a record.
Was it every time it was supposed to be? Every
time you played one side of a record, because the needle and the groove, the needle fits itself into the groove. So when you then take it out and play another record, it will slightly disrupt the groove.
Oh.
So you're supposed to change the needle.
I didn't know that, because I remember my grandparents had one, and there was a pot of needles.
That's right.
And the top right
in the corner that used to swing out, didn't it? A little,
and you could go and buy a load of needles. I can't remember. I bought them in a bag or something. Just
you
them in there.
And you screwed them into the tip of it.
Yeah, it was a hard work to put them in.
Yeah, I really remember.
Huge, great, heavy tone arm. Yeah, if we call it a tone arm.
Yeah, and you buy them in the hundreds, and the tins are very collectible. So they're very beautiful needle tins that the companies produced. So they're about so big, and they hold a few. You could buy them in bags, but the tins would have beautiful designs on. There is a collector's market for them now.
Now, the Second World War, presumably far less people taking record players into action in the Second World War, because it's a less stationary war apart from anything else.
And also, it was less necessary because quite early on in the war, you got the British forces, and when the Americans came in, the American forces set up radio networks.
The radio networks, yes, of course.
Yeah. But the great thing about the radio network, again for popular music in Europe, is that the Americans, there was a recording ban, if you remember, in the States. The unions put a damper on recording for, I think, 2 years, so nobody was allowed to make a commercial record. But the government persuaded the unions to allow ACT to make what they called V-discs.
Yes.
And these were produced by the government, technically owned by the government. They were lent out to the forces. And everybody who was anybody made a V-disc, and they were shipped over to the field of war, whether it was Europe or the Far East or whatever, and they were played on the radio stations. And so you get Sinatra made V-discs, Benny Goodman made V-discs, Duke Ellington, every big popular swing, jazz, every crooner, Crosby. Yeah. They made these records, and after the war, a lot of them had been exchanged for, let's call it goods and favours by the forces. So a lot of them stayed in Europe, and they left European musicians with a body of work they could then copy from the top and singers of the day. So even, in Italy, one of the biggest collections of V-discs I've seen is in the Jazz Academy in Siena, in Tuscany. And they've got a terrific collection that was left behind in Italy and has been donated over the years. And so European musicians learnt, again, second generation of jazz players. Not quite bebop, it was a little early for that, but certainly people like Goodman, who had people like Teddy Wilson in his band. I mean, real influential players. You could hear their solos and learn their solos like you could off Dixieland Jazz Band record.
Bing Crosby used to he used to put out records where he would say, "You're not allowed to play this on the radio," didn't they? It said this on the label, didn't it?
Yeah. I think
but even commercial records that they didn't want them played on the radio because they wanted people to buy them instead.
Well, there was that. Bing Crosby may have done that. I mean, there was that fear initially that if people are hearing them on the radio, they won't buy them. But of course, if you hear a song on the radio then and you loved it, the chances of switching your radio
the reverse is true.
Were not very strong. So actually buying the record meant you really could hear it whenever you wanted to. On the radio, you might have, half an hour once a week where you had a decent chance, or you could send a request in on a postcard and hope the request was chosen.
Well, this is the thing. If you move into the post-war period in the 50s, and it was still the case in the 60s, BBC needle time agreements with the Musicians Union were so restrictive that they'd only play like half an hour recorded music a day or something like that. The rest of it,
the rest had to be sessions, didn't it?
Yeah. So those.
When did the decline start then for 78? Because I mean, was it in the 40s? Because there was some of those kind of pre-R&B, pre-rock and roll records were still on 78s, weren't they? There were various threats, weren't there? That there was a vinyl coming in.
Which is Ivory Joe Hunter's Talent King, which came out in 1946. I mean, that's a 78, and he's a kind of cross between Albert Hammond's Pete Johnson and Louis Jordan. He's a pianist, but he has that kind of small band swing that Louis Jordan had, and that's on 78. Again, it came from the States again. What happened in tape technology moved on because at the end of the war, the Germans were quite advanced in recording tape technologies. That went back to the States, and Bing Crosby was one of the first people to use it.
He was.
Yeah. And then soon after that, people started experimenting with commercially viable, slower speed records. And so you got the LP, which rotated at 33 1/3 RPM rather than 78. So it's a little bit bigger, but it's lighter, and you can fit 50 minutes of music on rather than 7 or 8. And then the single followed soon after that. So the American companies were making LPs by the end of the 50s. They started producing LPs in Britain at the beginning of the 50s. And then singles followed soon after. But it's quite a long tail of 78s because people weren't going to buy the new gramophones overnight. Not the older people, anyway. No. It's the time. So you move from 78s to 45s and 33 1/3. The companies didn't want you to buy them anymore, but people still wanted to buy them. So they kept them on for quite a while. I think in Britain, 78s would probably had their day by the early 60s, 61, 62. But you've got countries like India, massive market.
Yeah, it's still going on.
Or totally absent electricity supply.
Yeah.
So the market, you can get Lady Madonna on 78.
I know that's
so if you got a dance set from 1963 or 64,
plays 78s.
It does it?
Yeah.
So does it play 78, 33, and 16?
And 16.
Yes.
It did.
16 was spoken word records.
It wasn't it? It was a language linguaphone.
Linguaphone. Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the last 78s you talk about, I think, is "Move It" by Cliff Richard. But that's an interesting point that they carried on producing stuff like the Beatles on 78, which must be surely now very valuable, isn't it? I mean,
if you
get Sgt. Pepper on 78, I mean,
I don't think
I'd say it's an LP.
You need an album, but of course that's where the word album comes from. It's the idea that to get an entire symphony on record, you needed maybe 7 or 8 records, so they were put into an album. A cloth and card.
Yes, yeah.
But so you can get Lady Madonna. Certainly the
first, I meant single. Yeah.
First top 20 or the first top 12, which came out in Britain, which the NME produced. I think all but one of those records was a 78.
Yeah.
Or was a dual format. So a lot of the time you could buy a 78 or a 45.
The funny thing, I remember obviously the early days of the dance set and all those things, and that's what you wanted, and that was driven by the kids. Your grandparents would continue to have the wind-up gramophone, which they probably wouldn't use anymore, but it was there. And what was interesting is nobody tried to advance any kind of argument as to why the new sound wasn't as good as the old one, which is how it's gone pretty much ever since, isn't it?
Yeah. I think that's because the new sound came in at the same time as the teenager. And teenagers don't want to say what you had is better than what we've got.
No.
So,
And their ears were tuned differently, I think.
They
But
were.
also the new sound was infinitely better, wasn't it?
It was mixed differently, you know. It had a different function. And also that's the time where the dancette was never called a gramophone. I don't think it was. The only person I've heard referred to a dancette as a gramophone was Joanna Lumley. She had a newspaper column in the 80s, and she writes about her time in the 60s. Said, "My gramophone was a dancette."
Yes.
Well, I can remember when David and I first started working at the BBC, I can remember the Director General of the BBC was still referred to gramophone records. You know, and this was in 1982.
Well, I think still in the world of desert island discs. I mean, it won't be the same in the era of Lauren Laverne, but not long before it would have been your next disc.
Yeah, it was.
Rather sums up the image of somebody lifting a
heavy lump of shellac and slapping it on a turntable.
But that's a lot of people in the early years of Desert Island Discs tend to choose quite old records anyway, so they would have been on.
They had to go and get them out of the depths of the library. Probably get Ernest the "Oh for the Wings of a Dove." Or whatever
that's almost certainly been selected. I'm sure. You know, it's.
What's the most valuable 78 then? You know, on the collector's market. What's the one that's commanded the most amount of money?
The one that's demanded most. I'm not going to pick it up. I wish I could pick it up. But it's one of the tracks on this record here.
Oh, right.
Very influential Robert Johnson's King of the Delta Blues Singers. And it's the 78 of Me and the Devil Blues, which I've seen advertised in auction with a reserve of $20,000. And I've seen actually that I know there's copies been sold for over $12,000 plus buyer's premium. I think that's pretty much the most expensive that I'm aware of. I mean, markets change. Something else might become more. But that's the one I think is one of the most expensive. Those early blues, they weren't pressed in huge numbers.
No, absolutely, and they broke.
They broke. Yeah, you see, Caruso was pressed in huge numbers. They're pretty much worthless. Caruso 78.
Oh, really?
But if you've got a Robert Johnson 78, then you've got one of maybe a few hundred that were pressed.
Yeah.
A lot of which got lost or broken, or just played to the point where they're unplayable. Yeah. So, I think that's one. And, of course, the history of Robert Johnson helps. And the influence that Johnson...
Of course it does. Yeah. And it gets more, meaningful every year, really. More resonance, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's, at the moment, those old blues, Robert Johnson, probably if you've got Charlie Patton 78, it's worth a few bob as well. I think...
Well,
so we asked you for a greatest record, the greatest record ever made, a personal choice, just to
personal choice. Yeah. As soon as you emailed me, it was 8 o'clock this morning. I hadn't even got up, and faced with the decision, I thought, well, best pop record ever made is Mama Cass's "It's Getting Better." But
that's a good choice.
Very interesting choice.
Well, my favourite albums is Lowell Waterson's "Once in a Blue Moon," but it only came out on CD, so I picked this one.
Oh, Clear Spot.
Clear Spot.
Very good.
Keith Mark's Clear Spot. Brilliant record.
Hard work. Took some getting into.
No, not.
The reason I picked it, it's got the most. It's my favourite love song ever written is on that album.
Was that Too Much Time?
No, My Head Is My Only House.
Oh, yes.
Which I think has the most wonderful lyric. I'll let a train be my feet if it's too far to walk to you. The train don't go there, I'll get a jet or a bus. It's just beautiful. It's not your standard love song. It's got the most gorgeous guitar riff. That beautiful record. So the whole record is brilliant, but that track really, for me, it's finest love song ever written.
Oh, well, you can't go wrong with that. So look, it's been lovely talking to you,
and to you guys,
and to learn all about the 78 and your book with the Shellac And Swing.
Swing. I put a plug
there
in.
You go.
There it is.
Hold it up. Like it's a social history of the gramophone in Britain, and that's out now.
Yes.
Very nice to talk to you. And what are you looking forward to doing when lockdown is over, or is it not going to make any difference at all? Is it just going to stay there?
We're kind of missing eating out, but I mean, for the last we live in the countryside, so we've not been hemmed in. We've got countryside to walk in, and we've been cycling around. We're in Norfolk. We can walk or bike for ages and not come within 50 yards of another person. So
very, very flat, as Noel Coward says. Well, was it Oscar Wilde? Was it? It was Oscar.
No, it was Noel Coward thing, but he clearly
not very challenging.
It's not high, but it's rolling.
Oh, okay.
I can look out of my. If cycle to the top of my road, it's a 12% gradient to get to the top of my road. There's a track fairly close by, which is 23%. The thing with Norfolk is it starts low.
Okay.
Yeah, bits of
it's like Texas. They say about Texas, if you can see 50 miles around it. If you stand on a matchbox, you can see 100 miles. So that flat.
So it's not as flat as an old coward.
Brilliant. Lovely to talk to you.
Very nice
so
to
much.
see you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.